It's good to see you all again. Today I am going to read you the fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood. Now it's important for you to understand that Disney has mined the Brothers Grimm, and these were two brothers in Germany back in the 1800s who are the first folklorists. So folklore means the knowledge of the common people. And they were the first folklorists because traditionally it was thought that only wealthy people could make art. And the Brothers Grimm, both highly educated, decided that no, the common people have things to share with us. And so today I will read you the original version of Little Red Riding Hood, which is very, very, very different than the Disney version. Disney likes to tone down the violence. Disney likes to tone down the fear. Disney likes to disempower women. And, Disney wanted the stories to match up to his worldview, which was very patriarchal and very misogynistic. So in Disney versions of the Brothers Grimm stories, women need to be saved. So here we go. I want you to watch out for the part in this story where we have male birth fantasy, like we've talked about. But sit around. You listen to this first before you share it with your kids, okay? Because it's a lot more graphic and a lot more complicated than the Disney version you grew up with. Once upon a time, there was a dear little girl who was loved by everyone who looked at her, but most of all by her grandmother, and there was nothing that she would not have given to the child. Once she gave her a little riding hood of red velvet, which suited her so well that she would never wear anything else. So she was always called Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother said to her, "Come, Little Red Riding Hood, here is a piece of cake and a bottle of wine. Take them to your grandmother. She is ill and weak, and they will do her good." Now, it's important that you understand that a piece of cake back in the 19th century, and probably this story goes back hundreds of years prior to that, we're talking about a really hearty pancake, not a Duncan Hines cake. All right? She's not taking anything with frosting over there. She's taking actual food, maybe something made with wheat. Set out before it gets hot, and when you're going, walk nicely and quietly, and do not run off the path. And I want you to remember this. The path. Do not run off the path. And notice that Little Red's mom is teaching her how to take care of herself and how to keep herself safe and to actually help her grandmother. So in this story, what we have is an example of caring for elderly people. Because we have a grandmother who's sick. We have a daughter of the grandmother who is making food and wine for her. And she's asking her little daughter to do this errand. Normally, in today's society, if you told a child, "Hey, take this bottle of wine over to your grandfather or your grandmother," then social services would be called and people would panic. And how can you trust alcohol with a child? All right? But that's not how it was. When I lived in Paraguay, what has it been, 35 years ago, little kids went to the grocery stores or the almacenes, the convenience stores, and would pick up beer for their parents or alcohol for their parents. Okay, so set out before it gets hot, and when you're going, walk nicely and quietly, and do not run off the path, or you may fall and break the bottle, and then your grandmother will get nothing. And I don't know if you've been around grandmothers who like a little bit of wine, but it would piss her off if she didn't get it, right? And then your grandmother will get nothing. And when you go into her room, this is where she's teaching manners. When you go into her room, don't forget to say, "Good morning," and don't peep into every corner before you do it. Now think about this. Why would a parent tell a child who's visiting a sick grandparent not to look around everywhere? I don't know about your experience, but my experience shows that when people are ill, what happens to their house? Their house is messy. They don't have the energy to clean it up, and so you don't want to draw attention to that. "I will take care," said Little Red Riding Hood to her mother, and gave her hand on it. So a pledge, just like when we shake hands. By the way, probably the original reason why humans shake hands is not to pass COVID-19, but to show that you are weaponless. The grandmother lived out in the wood, half a league from the village, and just as Little Red Riding Hood entered the wood, a wolf met her. Red Riding Hood did not know what a wicked creature he was and was not at all afraid of him. Now, wolves have been the enemy of humankind in the sense that ever since humans started raising domestic animals, because wolves would come and take their domestic animals. A wolf is a predator. So I want you to think about today, in today's world, what a predator is online, for example, and think about how the wolf talks to Little Red Riding Hood. And Little Red Riding Hood is not afraid of him at all, because Red is very naive. She's inexperienced. So the wolf says to her, "Good day, Little Red Riding Hood." "Thank you kindly, Wolf." "Whither away so early, Little Red Riding Hood?" "To my grandmother's." What have you got in your apron?" Now, I'm not wearing an apron right now, but what does an apron cover up? It covers up our abdomen, right? And down past to our genitalia, typically. So this is kind of a creepy thing to be asking. Imagine this if we were in person and I walked up to you and I said, "What have you got in your backpack?" Or, "What do you have under your shirt?" This is creepy stuff, okay? And this story is so much more complex than how Disney presented it to us as children. It's a story about predatory behavior and being taken in and convinced by someone who wants to do evil to us. And so, what have you got in your apron? Cake and wine. Yesterday was baking day, so poor sick grandmother is to have something good to make her stronger. Where does your grandmother live, Red Riding Hood? So, we have the creepy thing about the clothing. We've also got, how many of you would feel comfortable if I walked up to you in a parking lot and said, where does your grandmother live? But Little Red is so naive, and this is a coming of age story. Meaning that you go from childhood to adulthood, or you have an insight that makes you grow up. And that's what many of the very best stories in all world literature are about, is how do you become who it is that you are. And Little Red replies back, a good quarter of a league farther in the wood. Her house stands under the 3 large oak trees. The nut trees are just below. You surely must know it. So Little Red gives a map to the wolf, right? It's kind of like if someone was online and, what's your phone number? What city are you living in? How old are you? The wolf thought to himself, "What a tender young creature. What a nice, plump mouthful. She will be better to eat than the old woman. I must act craftily so as to catch both." So what we have here is the wolf is a child gobbler. He's a predator and a child gobbler. And you'll remember back to the myth of Kronos, who gobbled all of his children. And this is an ongoing part of the stories in Western culture. Because the wolf doesn't just want Little Red, he wants the grandmother too. So he walked for a short time by the side of Little Red Riding Hood, and then he said, "See, Little Red, how pretty the flowers are about here. Why do you not look around? I believe, too, that you do not hear how sweetly the little birds are singing. You walk gravely along as if you were going to school, while everything else out here in the wood is very merry." And so here we have the wolf pointing out the world to the child. Now, in Christian tradition, there are 3 enemies of the soul. The world, the devil, and the flesh. The world, the devil, and the flesh. Now, Protestant religions, ones who are Christians who came after what I call Christians with a memory, and I'm not religious by any means this way, but Protestantism happened about 550 years ago, and you won't hear Protestant preachers talking about the world, the devil, and the flesh this way, as 3 enemies of the soul. But if you listen to their speeches, their sermons, you'll see that they actually are talking about these things. So he tempts her with the world. Look around, and it's a way of causing her to be distracted. Little Red Riding Hood raised her eyes, and when she saw the sunbeams dancing here and there throughout the trees and pretty flowers growing everywhere, she thought, "Suppose I take grandmother a fresh nosegay." Now, that doesn't mean that her grandmother has a gay nose. It's something to make your nose happy. So, flowers that are pleasing to the scent. That would please her too. It's so early in the day that I shall still get there in good time. So she ran from the path into the woods to look for flowers. So she ran from the path. She ran from the path. And whenever she had picked one flower, she fancied that she saw still a prettier one farther on, and ran after it. And so she got deeper and deeper into the woods. So think about the woods as a symbol for the world, or becoming worldly. Meanwhile, the wolf ran straight to the grandmother's house and knocked at the door. Hold on, let me knock. "Who's there?" And the wolf replied, "Little Red Riding Hood. She's bringing cake and wine. Open the door." Did you get that? "Little Red Riding Hood. She is bringing cake and wine. Open the door." Also keep in mind that cake and wine can be symbolic. Now, if you are part of the Christian tradition, you should understand what cake and wine would mean. Think about a ritual that uses cake and wine, and like I say, not Duncan Hines. Okay? Nothing with frosting on it. If you're part of Catholicism, that would be the wafer. and the blood. If you're part of Protestantism, that would be communion or the Holy Supper. And so a lot of Protestant churches don't believe in alcohol, and so they changed the wine to grape juice so it still looks like blood, right? And the grandmother replies, "Lift the latch. I'm too weak and cannot get up." The wolf lifted the latch. The door sprang open, and without saying a word, he went straight to the grandmother's bed and devoured her. Did that happen in Disney? No. So, he comes in. So not only is he wanting to be a child gobbler, he is a grandmother gobbler. And what do all perpetrators do after they've eaten somebody? Well, the answer is cross-dress, right? Then he put on her clothes, dressed himself in her cap, laid himself in bed, and drew the curtains. Little Red Riding Hood, however, had been running about picking flowers, and when she had gathered so many that she could carry no more, she remembered her grandmother and set out on her way. She was surprised to find the cottage door standing open, and when she went into the room, she had such a strange feeling that she said to herself, "Oh dear, how uneasy I feel today, and at other times I like being with my grandmother so much." So in this story, what it's teaching children is trusting your instincts. Because instinctively, Little Red feels uneasy. Why would the door be open? What the hell is going on in this house? And usually I feel fine about this. And she called out, "Good morning," but received no answer. So she went to the bed and drew back the curtains, and there lay her grandmother with her cap pulled far over her face and looking very strange. "Oh, grandmother," said she, "what big ears you have." "All the better to hear you with, my child." "But, grandmother, what big eyes you have." "All the better to see you with, my dear." "But, grandmother, what large hands you have." "All the better to hug you with, my dear." "Oh, but grandmother, what a terrible big mouth you have." "All the better to eat you with." And scarcely had the wolf said this, than with one bound he was out of bed and swallowed up Red Riding Hood. Hence, child gobbling, right? When the wolf had appeased his appetite, what do you do after you've eaten a grandmother and a grandbaby? He lay down again in the bed, fell asleep, and began to snore very loud. Now here in the Disney version, we have a woodcutter, because that's not violent to chop down trees, apparently. But in the original story, it's a huntsman, a man who hunts. And the huntsman was just passing the house and thought to himself, "How the old woman is snoring. I must just see if she wants anything." So he went into the room, and when he came to the bed, he saw that the wolf was lying in it. So the huntsman the huntsman is very observant. He knows how things typically are. He's observant. He's compassionate. He's strong. He is also lethal. Okay. So, going back just for a second before we find out what the huntsman does. World, devil, flesh. So in this story, we have flowers and the woods representing the world. We have, who would be the devil? I think the wolf. Because Little red is strayed from the path, and then we have the flesh, which is what the wolf gobbles up. So the huntsman sees the wolf and he says, "Do I find you here, you old sinner?" So now we have the wolf is a sinner. And in Christianity, who is the biggest sinner? It's got to be the devil, right? "I have long sought you," and meaning he's been hunting him for years. And why would a huntsman do that? Because wolves prey on sheep. But just as he was going to aim and fire at him, it occurred to him that the wolf might have devoured the grandmother, and that she might still be saved. So the huntsman wants to save the grandmother. What do we call somebody who saves people? We can call him a hero. Okay. Or a savior. So he did not fire the gun, but took a pair of scissors and began to cut open the stomach of the sleeping wolf. I'm hoping, as I read this to you, that you're thinking about the Adam and Eve myth or about the Kronos myth, because what we have here about to happen is the concept that I mentioned to you before. Of male childbirth fantasy. So the huntsman is giving the wolf a cesarean section, right? So he began to cut open the stomach of the sleeping wolf. And when he'd made 2 snips, just 2, he saw the little Red Riding Hood shining. And then he made 2 snips more, and the girl sprang out crying, "Ah, how frightened I've been, how dark it was inside the wolf." How dark it was inside the wolf. Now, Little Red Riding Hood has already been born once, right? When she was a little baby. And now she is born again. After the aged grandmother came out alive also, but scarcely able to breathe afterwards, Red Riding Hood, I don't know about you, but if a wolf just ate me and I'd gotten out of that wolf's stomach, I think I'd run. But it's kind of like in any horror movie where you know what the character should do, and they're like, "What's that noise? 7 of my friends have died. I think I'll go check that noise out." And they walk off stage and you hear, and then they're gone too, or you hear a scream. But no, fairy tales are not logical, just as horror movies are not. And so, once she got out, Red Riding Hood quickly fetched great stones with which she filled the wolf's belly. Okay, so here we have her being born again and fetching stones, which are rocks. And I want you to think about this idea, consider it anyway, that possibly we have a reference here to early Christianity. Jesus loved to nickname his disciples, meaning his students, the ones who followed him. And the chief among them, he nicknamed Rock. I'm not talking about the Rock, the one who does Fast and Furious, all that kind of stuff, or used to wrestle. I remember that too. Which is where the name Peter comes from. Peter means Petros. Peter means rock. All right? So she fills up this evil being with the rock, who ends up being the first pope or the first carrier on, or the head carry on of Christianity. And let's find out what happens to the evil that she's filled up. She fetched great stones, and they filled the wolf's belly, and when the wolf awoke, he wanted to run away, but the stones were so heavy that he collapsed at once and fell dead. Then all three were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it, because of course you gotta save that part, right? The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Red Riding Hood had brought, and revived. Can't you just see her? Hit me again, little Red. Hit me again. All right, but how do people feel after partaking of communion or the Eucharist? Or the Holy Supper? Typically, people who participate in those rituals, they feel revived. Okay? But Red Riding Hood thought to herself, as long as I live, I will never leave the path by myself to run into the woods when my mother has forbidden me to do so. So once again, we have the path. And the path, obviously, if you look at this allegorically, which is how I'm reading this story to you, equals the path to heaven. Now, that's a whole story here, and some scholars have argued in the past that the Brothers Grimm really didn't interview people for their stories, that they just wrote the stories down that were in their own family history, which is not true, and I think this is evidence of that, because now we have, even though we have a whole story, we have part 2 to the story, and it's very, very brief. And I think this shows that they interviewed one family and got Red Riding Hood's story. They interviewed another, and lo and behold, here's this ending. It's also related that once when Red Riding Hood was again taking cakes to the old grandmother, another wolf spoke to her and tried to entice her from the path. Now, I wrote up here that a wolf is a predator, right? And I gave you the example of online predators. I have a niece who's now in her 30s who was using the internet back when she was 12 years old, and she was very, very naive, very naive. She had been locked in her room. My sister adopted her. She wasn't part of my family until my sister adopted her, but she'd been locked in her bedroom for 5 years, from the time she was a baby until she was, until she was 7 years old. And that meant that she didn't get to go to school. She didn't go into the kitchen to eat. She lived in this room where she was locked up. And because of that, she was very, very behind socially, because she hadn't had any interaction. She had to defecate in her own bedroom, right? And because of that, she was very, very naive, too. And my sister and my brother-in-law worked and worked and worked with her to try to catch her up academically. And when my niece was about 12 or 13 years old, my sister got a phone call from a man asking for her daughter. And she said, "And who are you?" "Well, I'm her boyfriend." This man was 28. She was 12 or 13 years old. He had been taking advantage of her, contacting her over the internet, having her come and meet up with him. My sister took her daughter to the gynecologist. She had a torn vagina. She had 3 forms of venereal disease. Okay? That's the kind of predator we're talking about here. Or the devil, as Christians would call it. So, another wolf spoke to her and tried to entice her from the path. Red Riding Hood, however, was on her guard and went straight forward on her way, and told her grandmother that she had met the wolf and that he had said good morning to her, but with such a wicked look in his eyes that if they had not been on the public road, she was certain he would have eaten her up. "Well," said grandmother, "we'll shut the door so he cannot come in." Soon afterwards, the wolf knocked and cried, "Open the door, Grandmother. I'm Little Red Riding Hood, and I'm bringing you some cakes." But they did not speak or open the door, so the gray beard stole twice or thrice around the house, and at last jumped up on top of the roof, intending to wait until Red Riding Hood went home in the evening, and then to steal after her and devour her in the darkness. But Grandmother saw what was in his thoughts. In front of the house was a great stone trough, a huge trough. So she said to the child, "Take the pail, Red Riding Hood. I made some sausages yesterday, so carry the water in which I boiled them to the trough." Now, if you've ever boiled things in water, you know there's flavor in there. Red Riding Hood carried the water back until the great trough was quite full. Then the smell of the sausages reached the wolf, and he sniffed and he peeped down, and at last stretched out his neck so far that he could no longer keep his footing, and began to slip and slip down from the roof straight into the great trough, and was drowned. That's what we call baptism by immersion. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so he drowned. So the water killed the evil in this fairy tale. But Red Riding Hood went joyously home, and no one ever did anything to harm her again. Now, while you're thinking about this sort of interpretation, there are others. We could say, what's the moral of the story? What are the morals? Well, stranger danger, right? And we could say, what are the symbols? Well, the woods are going into the world or the unknown or into evil. What's the wolf? We could say he symbolizes evil as well, or the wolves themselves. We could also say that water is a symbol of purity, right? We could also say that red is the color of blood, which is a symbol of menstruation. Hold on. Let me spell that right. So that little red is a pubescent girl, someone who can actually produce a child, whether she's ready to or not. And we could also say that the wolf, besides doing the allegorical analysis, represents the bad boyfriend, or that one who is going to take advantage of innocence. And Little Red goes from naive to a killer, where she can kill the things in her life that are going to harm her. All right? As you're thinking about this kind of interpretation of the story, besides stranger danger, and obviously most people are more likely to harm, children are more likely to be harmed by their family or their family friends, their circle, than a stranger. So even though I was taught, stranger danger, can you imagine if they taught in schools? Daddy danger, or uncle danger, or a strange friend danger. You know, strange friend of my daddy danger, or grandpa danger. But they don't do that. I want you to go online and Google Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs. Little Red Riding Hood. And this is a song that was a popular hit back in the very early 70s. And see how Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs interpret the story. And in this song, when you look it up, there's no video, sorry. It'll just show you the cover of the album. You have the wolf talking about being a wolf in sheep's clothing. So pretending to be something that he is not. I also want you to think about the connection between this story and domestic abuse or violent sexual violence. All right, that's the end of the story. Please don't let your kids listen to it, or maybe you want to. My kids listened to this story when they were little, and they've turned out okay. But I want you also to compare this to the version of Disney that you got, and think about how Disney actually is pushing patriarchy and the idea that women are helpless. One final note. There's a concept called the divine feminine, which is part of paganism. Pagan has a bad rap today, the paganism does, because Christians tend to think that that means people who are evil. But literally the word pagan means people who live in the country. And maybe you live in Ocala. I live here in Levy County. I live in the country, okay? So people who live in the country, not people who are devil worshippers. But in paganism, you have a concept of the divine feminine, which is the maiden, the mother, and the crone. The three phases of a woman's life. And so in this fairy tale, as in so many of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, you have the maiden, red, the mother is the mother, and the crone, an old lady, is the grandmother. So we could also interpret this fairy tale as a male force wanting to destroy the divine feminine. I hope you enjoyed the story. I look forward to telling you one more before the semester ends. Or some more, who knows. But I will tell you another at another time. Thank you.